Hi everybody, this is the how-to video for your Notan expansion of a square in color. And I just want to talk about some of the things that I talked about in the light value color lecture, which you need to read the entire lecture because I can't possibly go over all of that in a video. But anyway, I wanted to start talking about just color in general as a visual element. It's the most powerful of all of the visual elements that we've studied so far. And the reason is because it has certain physiological effects. If you walk into a gallery and there are a lot of works in there and most of them are in black and white, and then you have one or two that use very intense color, the color work will be what attracts your attention the most first because of those physiological effects. Some examples of those effects are that red raises blood pressure, blue lowers blood pressure, pink tends to have a calming effect, and so on. There are many other effects, and artists will usually know about these and have studied some color theory. So if we look at this quote by Johannes Itten, he was a famous artist in the Bauhaus, and he came over here around the time of World War II with Joseph Albers, and they worked in color theory together, and they believed in all the different effects and that you could create using different color in your work. In the quote, he says, "Color effects are in the eye of the beholder. Yet the deepest and truest secrets of color are, I know, invisible even to the eye and are beheld by the heart alone." And this is one of his works here, an abstracted design with very beautiful colors. These look much better in the lecture, by the way. I just printed these out, and I don't have the greatest printer, so make sure you view the lecture as well. So what he's talking about here is that he believes that the use of color in his work for him is really about emotion and expressing certain feelings, and it's kind of a thing that you experience without words when you view a work of art. So I just want to go over the basic color harmonies. You've got 4 basic color harmonies. Monochromatic, which means you use one hue, and you can see we have tints and shades of blue in this work by Robert Scherer called Nestor. You have analogous color harmonies. Those are colors that are close together on the color wheel. I'll just show you an example. Here's an example of the color wheel. I'm not going to use this one to go over it because I'm used to yellow being at the top and it's a little confusing, but analogous color harmonies use colors that are close together on the color wheel. So it could be warm tone or cool tone. In this case, we've got a warm tone analogous color harmony in this painting by Auguste Renoir. Beautiful portrait that he did, and you can see the colors are very neutralized. You've got lots of white and black added in. Neutralizing also means when you add 2 complements to each other. If I add blue and orange together, eventually I'll get to gray, and that's true of all the complements, which are directly opposite. Here we've got mostly colors that are mixed from reds, yellows, and oranges, and a lot of neutrals added into. And you have complementary color harmonies in this painting, the Arnolfini Wedding by Jan van Eyck, 15th century Dutch painter. You can see you've got complements of green and red and blue and orange. So it's actually probably a tetradic as well. And then you have a lot of beautiful neutrals that are added in. It's also an example of iconography that was very typical of the Dutch painting at that time, especially the Vanitas still life. You would have little objects and things like the dog added into the work that represent certain things, such as the dog would represent fidelity, their shoes, the fact that they're standing in stockings represents that they're standing on sacred ground. Perhaps this was a recording of a wedding. The fruit on the table would represent fertility for their wedding. And you can see in the beautiful realism, the perspective of the work. This was very typical of Dutch painting at this time. You got the beautiful light coming in the detail and the spatial depth. And you've got triadic color harmonies. Those are color harmonies that use harmonies that are equidistant on the color wheel. And in the pigmented color wheel, I'm going to show you another one eventually, you've got red, yellow, and blue are the primary colors. You can see they form a triangle and they're equidistant. They tend to create a stabilizing effect. Analogous color harmonies tend to create a harmonious effect because they're close together. And also monochromatic color harmonies also create a stabilizing effect. That's the easiest color harmony to work with. Complementary color harmonies, because you're using one color, the monochromatic. For complementary color harmonies, you have the effect of usually a dynamic effect because the complements have certain optical effects. one of them is called simultaneous contrast. So if you have complements placed next to each other, they tend to intensify each other. So in this painting by Henri Matisse, we've got the triadic design, we've got some white and black, an abstracted portrait of a woman, and this is also an example of subjective arbitrary color, which I'll go back to later. Okay, so I just want to talk about some terms that are used to describe use of color in artworks. We have what's called local color, and what that means is the colors look like they appear in white light. In this painting by Dutch still life painter Jan David Stehem, painted in 1642, you can see it's a realist painting, and the colors pretty much look like what we expect them to look like. The lemons are yellow, the lobster is red, and so on. So local color is color as it appears under white light or daylight. And then we've got what we call heightened color. These are all in the, this is all in the handout on the lecture, by the way. In this painting by Paul Gauguin, a post-impressionist painter in the 19th century, you can see it's a landscape, beautiful landscape. It's a little bit abstracted, expressionistic almost. And he worked with Vincent van Gogh, who was really an early precursor of expressionism in the 19th century. And you can see that the colors look pretty much probably like what he was looking at. They painted in the south of France together. In the landscape, you would have been painting, maybe from imagination or actually standing outside. But he's heightened them, so they're intensified, and that's done usually when you intensify local color. It's usually done to create an emotional effect or a design effect. Then we have what's called optical color. For optical color, you have the color as it appears under different times of day, at night. It could be different seasons, different atmospheric effects. And these two paintings by Claude Monet, is the leader of the Impressionist painters in the French Impressionist movement. These were painted in the 19th century, paintings of the London Houses of Parliament, and he did a whole series. In the midpoint in his career, he started painting series of the same scene or the same object at different times, different times of year, different times of day, and so on, different weather, and you would get different effects of the light, and that's called optical color. He actually was trying, in the Impressionists, were trying to paint the colors as they were changing, through time, as they would be working outside. That was a very dramatic thing that they did at that time, that they would go outside and paint entire finished works outside and maybe touch them up a little bit in the studio. Whereas prior to that, people would paint, they would maybe do sketches outside, and they would go into the studio and they would do, a more finished painting, which was designed entirely in the studio. Okay, so then you have what we call arbitrary color. Subjective arbitrary color. I'm going to go back to the example of the Triadic color harmonies, the painting by Henri Matisse, a very famous figurative painter, a great painter in the 20th century. And you can see that he's used the color subjectively. So he's not doing local color. He's not painting the woman, exactly as she would look in 3 dimensions with whatever color she was wearing and whatever was in the room. He's putting this triadic design of color to create a certain effect, sometimes a design effect, emotional effect, or both. And you have, next is symbolic color. Unfortunately, this was upside down. And in symbolic color, you have use of color to represent certain things, and it could be different in different cultures. In this example, we have Madonna of the Meadow, painted by Raphael in the 16th century Italian Renaissance. And he represented the Madonna in this painting. Obviously, she's wearing red and blue, and that was how she was always represented in paintings. So people would know, if they, most people couldn't read at those times, but if they saw a painting, then they would know who she was by the colors that she was dressed in. And other examples of symbolic color would be traffic signs, flags, and so on, things like that, that we recognize by the color and the shape that symbolizes certain things to us. And we have what's called emotional color. Really, all use of color is emotional on some level because it does have those physiological effects. Whether it's very vibrant and highly saturated, whether it's more muted, it's certainly still going to have an effect on you emotionally. And artists know that, they study that, and they use it intuitively, and they maybe use it intentionally in certain cases as well. So in emotional color, in this painting by Paul Klee, you can see he's used all of these beautiful colors. He's got some contrasting with the warm tones with the orange to create a certain emotional effect, of a beautiful pattern of rhythm of the shapes and the different colors together. Okay, so I just want to talk about a couple other things to do that you can think about with the use of color in work. We talked about atmospheric perspective with the perspective drawing, how you could, by having things be darker and more intense and more focused in the foreground, and as they go off into the distance, they get neutralized and hazier. You can see in this painting by George Caleb Bingham, Fur Traders Descending the Missouri. It's a 19th century artist. You can see in the foreground, the figures on the boat are, the colors are more intense and they're more focused. And as we go off in the distance, the layering effect, everything is getting hazier and softer and more neutralized, and it creates that feeling of atmospheric perspective and create spatial depth. So you can actually, with color, you can create spatial depth also by putting warmer colors closer to the foreground of a work and cooler colors off in the distance. You can often create a feeling of spatial depth that way as well. Another thing to think about with this particular painting is we feel the space is expanding horizontally as well, because we know this is a long river that they're traveling down, and we can just imagine that there's a big space around outside of the picture plane. Okay, so another thing to think about, I've talked about how important the use of color as well, and I think I talked about this in the lecture, if this is in the beginning of this lecture, but I talked about this in other works that you did, how important the use of the grayscale value pattern, what we call the value pattern, is very important in your work. You can create an emotional effect with that, and then you add color, and it's very different because you're talking about the physiological effects, the saturation of the color, and how they all interact. But they can be used together. But some artists have actually did not want color to be the dominant thing in their work, and Leonardo was one of those artists. He actually said, in a quote, I believe, that color was the enemy of painting, which is a pretty strong thing to say. But you can see when we put Mona Lisa into grayscale, the balance and the whole feeling of the work is really controlled by the black-white value scale. It was very important to him. And this is an artist who has total control over his technique and his work. Now, the original Mona Lisa, the Mona Lisa will never be cleaned because it's too expensive and it would just be a disaster if anything happened to it. The original Mona Lisa, probably in the video that we watched, you saw there was probably a little bit more colorful than the one with the years of varnish and the yellowing and everything, but still, the thing that he controls his work with, he did not want people to be swayed by the emotional effect of color in his work. And then Vincent van Gogh was the opposite. He actually said that color is what makes a painting because color was what he used to create the emotional effects, the psychological effects in his work, to convey what he wanted to convey in his work. And seeing this painting, Café sur la Place, one of his many night paintings that he did, if we put it into grayscale, the balance doesn't really change too dramatically. It doesn't become unbalanced or anything like that, but you can see how important all these warm tones of color contrasting with the cooler color in the darker areas is very important in the work to him. If we look at this painting by minimalist painter Ad Reinhardt, you can see that some artists really rely very heavily on the color in the work. The balance doesn't change. It's still a symmetrical design, but these fuchsia rectangles of the painting, we can't even see them once they're turned into grayscale. This painting comes across much better in the actual lecture. Okay, then we have the two different color wheels. We've got the additive color wheel, which is the color wheel in actual light. Those are the colors in the spectrum. The primaries are different. We've got red, green, and blue. Equidistant again, those are the primaries. And then in the subtractive color wheel, which would be artists like painters who work with pigments, additive color wheel would be artists like photographers, stage lighters, and artists like that. We've got, the primaries are different. We've got red, yellow, and blue. And then you've got the secondaries, green, violet, and orange. And then in between a primary and a secondary, red and orange, you have the tertiary, which is mixed with them, obviously. There are many more colors than you see on the actual color wheel. You can add tints or shades, and if you add white or black into a color, you can neutralize the colors to make a gray. If you add two complements together, such as red and green, that's called neutralizing the color. And then you can just experiment. If you're working with paints, I encourage you to just experiment. Just mix different colors together and see what happens. Always make sure if you're working with watercolors or whatever, you clean your brush every once in a while so your colors don't get too muddy. Okay, so I have the examples again of the color harmonies that I have on the handout that are 8 that you could choose from for your design. We've got the analogous colors. This is a cool tone analogous colors that are close together. We've got the triadic. I use the primaries, red, yellow, and blue. They're equidistant, tends to create a stabilizing effect. It all depends on how you balance out the colors. You know, it just depends on what you do with it, really, as it does with everything in life. The complements are directly opposite, blue and orange, and those create that simultaneous contrast effect, that I mentioned before. That's when you have two complements placed next to each other, they tend to intensify each other. There's another optical effect of complements called afterimage, and you should look at that in the lecture. I have an example of a Jasper John painting. You can get the demonstration of afterimage with that too. You've got what we call an accented analogous. This was a cool tone analogous harmony, and this one is an accented analogous with a warm tone analogous, and then you've got some cool tones that are accenting it. Usually the accent will be a complement, because either you're going to have a warm tone or a cool tone, and then the opposite for the accent. Monochromatic color harmonies, we showed you that before. That's when you have one hue here. We've got red, tints and shades of red. Those are the most easy harmonies to work with because you're just working with one color, and it's going to create a feeling of harmony no matter what you do with it. You've got the split complement. That's when you have a color, such as in this case yellow, okay, and instead of I don't know why they don't, I don't know, the way they've done this on this color really looks kind of strange. You can't really see it, so I'm going to get the other one to show you. If you take a color such as yellow, instead of what you do in the complement, this one we have blue and orange, and this one we've got yellow, and instead of using violet, the complement, in a split complement, you use the colors on either side of that color's complement. So I used yellow, red violet, and blue violet in this one. Okay, and then we have the most complex color harmonies. For these ones, I'm not going to show you on the color wheel because I didn't have time to draw the square and the rectangle. But in the tetradic color harmony, for these you've got two sets of complements, and it's either going to form a rectangle between the colors or a square. Now for the tetradic design, they recommend having one color dominate, so it's a little bit easier to manage the balance and everything. Again, that just depends on the saturation and everything else that's going on. But I did do that in this one. I have orange I have the most quantity of orange in this one, and then I have smaller quantities of the other three colors. In the square design, they recommend, and I wrote this all down on the handout so you can read it there. They recommend that you use equal amounts of each color to create a balanced design. But again, it's really all about what your design is and what you're trying to do. But you could follow those in the beginning when you're learning how to do all of this. So those are your choices. And then I'll just get to the actual examples of the Notans. This is one of the ones that I did in the video with a grayscale. And you can see that I did a complement. This was a cut paper collage. And I used the blue and the orange. I didn't do a direct reversal because I chose to use white for the background. You could use black, white, or gray for your background and then just put the colors in the actual design. Or if you want to, you could use a color for the background, like I could have used orange for the background and then blue for the square. And it would have had a direct reversal that way. So this one worked nicely. And the way I did it was I just traced my original rectangle, and then I traced onto my construction paper to get the shapes to cut out. I showed you how to do that in the perspective. And then this one I did with markers and ink pens. I had a lot of fun with this one. This was the butterfly and ladybug garden design that I showed you. You can see for this one, I really was not thinking about a specific color harmony. You should, because you'll learn them that way. But I just basically did whatever I wanted to do, like I would do in one of my paintings. And I have a lot of stuff going on here. I would have to analyze it to see how many color harmonies are actually in here. We've definitely got some complements and probably tetradic and maybe even a square. So we have a lot of stuff going on. Then I added in the gold tones. This is more like what I do in my paint. I've done pretty much everything, every type of style you could imagine. I've done that in my painting over the years. This is probably one of my favorite styles, apart from my abstract designs. I like to paint in I'm not sure what the word is. Decorative is what a lot of people would call this in a negative way, but I don't see it as negative. Sort of like little pieces of jewelry, you know, where you have a lot of detail and just happy little images like this. So I had a lot of fun with this, and this should give you an idea of what you want to do. For this one, what I did was I traced my original square, and I transferred my design over, and then I just flip it over to reverse out for the reversals. And that's the easiest way to do it, is just trace it. If you didn't do it, you know, if you didn't do it as a drawing and you just did it cut out, you would trace it off of your cut paper collage if you did it as a collage or whatever. But however you're doing it, I'm sure you'll figure it out. And you can always email me any questions you have, okay? So have a lot of fun. I'm going to do another video about working in color, where I talk about the Joseph Albers projects that we're going to work on too. Okay, so have fun with this. Take care.